in Jonah, so it's going to be a lot different than what we've had so far. But did you read through those? Because they're very short. Yeah, so it won't take an hour to go through those. So I'm going to do a little review of what we've done so far, but incorporate some of the prophets too, and then go and cover thoroughly Ruth and Jonah. So, remember, most of what we've done so far was written by two sets of writers, what we call the Deuteronomic history, which was Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And Chronicle, who may have been Ezra, which is 1st Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So, historically, you could call it what we've done, the rise and the fall of the kingdom of Israel. So remember, we started, the Jews are slaves in Egypt under Moses. They escaped. They spent some time in the promise. They spent some time in the desert to make a covenant with God on Mount Sinai, promising faithfulness to God. They eventually make it to the promised land. Moses dies right before they get there. Joshua leads them into the promised land. They divide up into their 12 tribes. They do have to keep fighting for the land, though. In Judges, when Joshua dies, judge is a local leader. And then after Judges, we have 1 Samuel, who's like the last judge, who appoints the first king, who is Saul. And then the second king, who is David. And it's under David that they finally defeat the Philistines and have what we call it a kingdom. Not very big by today's standards, but a kingdom. And when he dies, his son Solomon takes over. They build a huge temple in Jerusalem as a place for sacrifice and worship. But then when Solomon dies, they disagree on who the successor is. The country split in half, north and south, the north being called Israel, the south being called Judah. And they both decline in prestige and power. In 721, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, called Israel. And then the low point, just like the high point for David, the low point for the Jews happens after 586, when Babylonians destroy Judah, including the city of Jerusalem and the temple. The people are exiled. They live in Babylon, modern Iraq, for almost 50 years. And that's the end of the historical books, except for then we have Ezra and Nehemiah after that. They came back. Nehemiah helped rebuild Jerusalem and getting a wall around the city and getting 10% of the people to live there. Haggai and Zechariah were two prophets that said we need to rebuild the temple. They did that. Ezra put together much of the written, what we now call much of the written Old Testament, and proclaimed it to everybody and said, all right, we didn't follow this the first time. We need to make sure we do it right this time. So that is the history, very brief history of the Old Testament, history of Israel. Along the way, we've noted that, not very good views of foreigners. Ezra and Nehemiah even saying that one of the reasons for all these bad things happening is we got too many influences from our foreign lives, so we need to get rid of them and send them home, so that we maintain our identity specifically to our faith in our God. All right, so I'm going to do a couple of prophets tonight to show that, all right, is there anybody that was saying things different than that? All right, some of you maybe were surprised that we got a lot of violence in here, in the so-called historical books. How about the other books? All right, so we've got prophet books, we've got wisdom books, and we've got what I call story books, like Ruth and Jonah. So we're going to find some different views in those books. And when it comes to the prophets, we talked about three prophets. Remember, Nathan was a prophet to David. He's the one that said, you won't build the temple, but your son will. And Nathan was also instrumental in helping decide which of David's sons would become the next king. And Elijah and Elisha were the two most known prophets. They don't have books named after them, but they were very involved in the books of Kings and emphasizing faithfulness to Yahweh, the God of Israel. So, were there people saying things other than the thing that God gets upset about is when we worship other gods? Is there anything else that God worries about? Okay, so prophets are going to tell us some of that. And some of these storybooks will remind us of how God is as well. So that's a quick summary of what we've done and some of the theology or ideas about God from the Bible so far. All right, so I'm just going to do one little prophet here before I do Ruth and Jonah, and that is the prophet Hosea, because he's also talking about how the people were unfaithful to God. And I'll just point out a couple of things in that book which kind of support some of what we've heard. He's going to be critical of their practice of the faith, but he's going to couple that with the fact that God is loving and forgiving. So, I'm just going to point out some things from the book of Hosea. So, if you find that by looking at the table of contents, it says that God tells Hosea there's a reason why you would be a really good prophet. We don't know if he was a priest. Priests, of course, back then are much different than today. But he must have had some kind of cult work maybe in the temple area. But anyway, God comes and tells him, you will be able to understand how God feels. Because it says you're going to marry a harlot. So anyway, it says that Hosea and his wife have 3 children. But he doesn't know if any of them are his. Okay? So the reason for that, though, is this is an allegory, or this is what God feels like with Israel, because Israel has been so unfaithful to God. God has been faithful to Israel. Israel has not been faithful to God. So, just skimming through Hosea, if you look at the headings, so chapter 1, marriage to an unfaithful wife, talking about punishment. Chapter 4.
Was there any reason why he gave them names?
Yes, the names always, if you look at their asterisks, it says what the names mean if you translate them.
Okay.
So yes, the names are pretty, like one of them was like, means not mine, or not my own.
Not good, not my people.
So there's names, the names always, names of people and towns always have some kind of significance. But your asterisks explain those. In chapter 4, it says the crimes of Israel. Okay, so those are the things that Israel has done that are bad. And you do notice there are some things there that are different other than just worshiping the wrong God. Priests not worshiping right. That's in the middle of chapter 4. They're no better than the people. Chapter 4, verse 9, the priests are no better than the people. Chapter 5, the leaders. Okay. They don't let people astray. Last line of chapter 5, insincere conversion. They're not serious about that. Middle of chapter 7, failure of the monarchy. Our kings have been bad. Foreign alliances. No, don't bother making alliances with other countries. It's not going to work. Okay? So, and you can see by the other headings what those are about. What stands out, though, in Hosea is chapter 11. So this is God speaking when Israel was a child. I loved him, so Israel is him. Out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the farther away they went. They sacrificed to Baal. Remember, Baal is the main god of the Canaanites. Burning incense to idols. It talks about the things that they did. I drew them with human cords, with bands of love. So, like one raises an infant to his cheeks and so on. But if you look through that, it's loving language. They say, this is how much God cared for us, but then we went astray. And verses 8 and 9, how can I give up on it? How can I treat you like these other cities that were destroyed? My heart is overwhelmed, my pity is stirred. I have all kinds of reason to be angry at your unfaithfulness to me, but I can't go on with that. So basically the book is just like Hosea stays with his wife even though she's been unfaithful to him. Why? God still loves Israel. So that 11th chapter is primary part about that. So there's some mean things in there, the punishment for being so unfaithful, but God's also forgiving and has loved Israel from the beginning and cannot give up on Israel. All right, so the reason I went over that was that it does talk about unfaithfulness to God as being one of the causes for all these bad things that happen, but it also does emphasize forgiveness of God and love of God in spite of that. So, some similarity, but a little bit different from what we've been hearing from these other books so far. And I do that because that leads us into 2 books now that are going to be a lot different than the prevailing thought that we've had. So kind of think of it as all those historical books are, here we can go to the courthouse and we get historical files and we'll write all this down with a little bit of our commentary along the way. So here's what happened, a little bit about here's why. And written by people who really are going to say the main reason is when we weren't faithful to God, things went bad. And if you take that to the extreme, you get to the idea of you better not have any foreign influence then. These other people, in many cases, we kill them because they're a bad influence. Okay, so we want is that always the case? So we're going to balance it off now by going to the book of Ruth. So it's only 4 chapters. And not as hard to read because you can follow the story. And it's placed where it is in our Bible because the setting for the book is during the time of Judges. It's written way, way later than that, but it's placed back in that time. So it would be like me writing a book today in which the setting is what the time Columbus arrived in America. We talk about something in the early American colonies or whatever. Okay? So, did you read the story, a lot of you? I don't think because it wasn't real difficult. Okay? So anyway, it talks about Naomi as this woman from southern Israel, and she has a husband and 2 sons, and then there's a famine in the area, or her husband dies, or there's a famine. They go to Moab, which is this little territory next to Israel, and both sons marry local women there. So they're marrying non-Jewish women. And it says after about 10 years or so, 2 things happen. Both of her sons die, and the famine ends back home. So she's going to go back home. So she tells her 2 daughter-in-laws, thank you. Thank you for marrying my sons and helping take care of me and so on, for being hospitable while we were here in your land. Now it's time for me to go back home. So basically, thank you and goodbye. And they say, well, maybe we should go with you. And she says, no, you need to go back to your own. You need to reestablish your own homes. You need to have kids with your local people. Anyway, and I need to go home. So then one of the daughters-in-law says, okay, thank you. And they gets to say goodbye. And then Ruth, on the other hand, is going to stay. And a couple weeks ago, I was in Salix, and I saw the entry to the church. They had a Bible verse. Anyway, it was Ruth 1:16. So that is one of the nicer verses of the entire Bible. When Ruth is asked to go home, she says, no, I'm going to go with you, Naomi. So verse 16 is, do not ask me to abandon or forsake you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there be buried. So death will not separate us. So no, I'll go back to Israel with you and take care of you as if you were my own mother. So, main characters are Naomi and Ruth. So the 2 of them go back. It says they live in the area around Bethlehem. And they go out and they glean in the fields. Naomi's a little bit old to do that. But Ruth does that. You know what glean the fields means? Okay? When I mentioned that when I taught the class, some kids said, oh, that's why they call some combines like a gleaner. Yeah. That's because it doesn't miss anything. It doesn't miss anything. That's the reason for the name there. Here, yeah, back then, you obviously didn't get it all when you harvested. And barley is the crop. So, remember they always said that's what the remnant of the crop is that goes to the ground. That's to be left there for poor people. So that's what Ruth does. So she goes out and gets the barley, and comes back to Naomi. Here's what I have today. Naomi says, good. Okay, and then another time, Ruth is out, and this guy tells her, I really hear you've really been really nice to Naomi. You don't need to go to other places. You get enough here. Tomorrow, as a matter of fact, today we're doing this field. We can just follow up our harvest, and then we've got a nice supply there for you and your mother-in-law. And so she does that. She tells her mother-in-law about it, and Ruth starts to like the guy who owns that farm, a single man named Boaz. And Naomi says, well, really, he is from our clan, if you're interested. And then they got some symbolism of the time. It's very seldomly did a woman express her interest in a man who's the man who kind of dictated relationships. But in this one, Naomi says, well, you know what? Sleep at his feet. That's kind of a symbol of, I'm interested in you. And then he'll respond accordingly. And then he says, yes, there is one other relative, though, who would have a prior claim, because remember, if someone dies without leaving a child, the closest relative is supposed to do that. So anyway, there's one other guy we need to get approval from. So the next day at the city gate, which is where you transact business, Boaz gets 10 of the elders of the city and says, all right, I'm here to conduct some business. He waits for the other guy, says, all right, now that Naomi's going to sell the land that she had, and I'm interested in buying it. Are you? And he says, yes. And I'll definitely make a claim. And then he says, all right, and there's also this lady to marry. And the other guy, I think, is like, all right, maybe the land. I don't know if I'm ready for wife and family yet, though. So he gives Boaz approval to go ahead and pursue a relationship with Ruth. And he does, and they agree to become husband and wife. So that is chapters 2 and 3. And then in chapter 4, they get married. And then there's some local traditional things that are in there. And then they have a child. And Ruth and Boaz present the child to Naomi, meaning this child is yours. This is your descendant from your sons, even though it's not your blood relative, it's your daughter-in-law's, but we accept you as this child's grandmother, and we'll carry on your line accordingly, and Naomi accepts that. And a line in there that I really like is verse 15. This child will be your comfort and support. For his mother is the daughter-in-law who loves you. She is worth more to you than 7 sons. So 7 is always a number they use for something good. But obviously at this time, sons were valued more than daughters. But here we have this lady is so good, such a nice person. She's worth more than any son. And then it concludes by saying what happens to this son. I mean, we don't know much about him other than the story. However, it says he is named Obed. And Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. So then, according to the story, Ruth would be the great-grandmother of David. So, the author is telling us, you know, even David had some non-Jewish background in his family. And as far as that goes, it's probably true of most of us. And now, after all these other stories that we've read about fighting and other people being bad, we have this story, which basically tells us, wow, if we studied anybody this whole time we've been reading the Bible, have we found a better person than Ruth? And she wasn't even one of us at the end. She was from Moab. So that is why the story of Ruth is so significant. So it really offsets so much of the other things. So yes, it's important that we worship the right God. Yes, it's important that we don't give in to other cultures and all other bad habits that we might be exposed to. However, they're not all bad. Look at Ruth. We can't find a better person than her. Who wouldn't want Ruth as your daughter-in-law? So this is the story of Ruth. A lot of the students, especially girls, like that story. First of all, because it wasn't violent. Second of all, because it was easy to read. You didn't have to know a lot of background and stuff. And third, yes, you got a really nice person. So, and then when I mentioned it, yeah, this is pretty easy to relate this to our lives. I'm sure we all know someone who's not Catholic is a really good person. I'm sure we all know someone who's maybe not of the same cultural or ethnic background as us, who's a really good person. Yeah, that's what Ruth was. So, yeah, just because someone is different from us, that doesn't mean they can't be really good.
YouTube has a good 20 minutes, just a real short, the whole story of Ruth.
Okay.
It was really interesting. They sealed the deal by him taking his slipper off.
Yes, that's yeah, that was in there too. Yes. A lot of it. So you can find out what some of the symbolism was back then. Yeah, removing a shoe was significant. Is it okay? Yep, I renounce my claim. So yes, you now can proceed. So, any thoughts, questions, comments on Ruth?
Did they have more than one wife at that time? They didn't.
He
wouldn't have had another wife.
He didn't, you know. Basically, the answer is really, really important men did.
Oh.
So, like, if you were a king, you could have as many wives as you wanted. But most people didn't do that. So, yes, that's really one of the more important books, I think. Especially in light of the other things that we've heard. It just tells us so many things about what's important. So again, who could be better than Ruth to have as a relative? What's the most loving statement? I always often said too that two of the nicest relationships in the Bible, as far as role models for us, are remember Jonathan and David were best friends. Jonathan, even though his dad wanted to kill David, he cut that out. He was still best friends with David, but still loyal to his dad. And then Ruth and Naomi. Where can you find a better relationship than that? And where can you find a better role model than Ruth?
So, if you go to the New Testament, you look at the genealogy, a lot of those people you recognize as being written about in the Old Testament.
Yes.
But although they knew it was going to be the Savior was going to be born to somebody of David's, how did a lot of people have things written about them? I mean, how did they write about people that they wrote about?
They were so into their tribes that they kept track of that family tree. So when they first settled the land, were from this one of the 12. And remember, they didn't have last names back then. Your last name basically was who your father was. You know, Joshua was always Joshua, son of Nun. Even in Jesus' time, whenever they talked about James and John, it's always James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And eventually, that's where a lot of last names came from, was from your father's name. Yeah, Johnson, son of John, yeah. So, they did do that. Now, I'm glad you did mention that. So before I go to Jonah, I'm just going to go, since you mentioned genealogy. And, you know, they're probably not 100% accurate like we would be today, but they reasonably close. Matthew, because he writes his gospel to people of a Jewish background, begins with the genealogy of Jesus, which is what you're talking about. So let's just take a look at that quick. Go to the very beginning of Matthew's gospel. So if you go to Matthew and then to the first chapter, verses 2 through 6. Remember my scripture professor from seminary saying, some people wonder, all this genealogy is traced through the fathers. So this guy is a father, this guy is a father, this. But they mention a few women in there. Why those particular women? And he says, because, they're the non-Jewish ones. If you knew the father, you pretty much would know the mother, because of the background. So, Rahab, remember Rahab was the one who helped the spies get out of Jericho? So she's mentioned there, and one other lady, and then Ruth. So when it comes down there, father of Boaz, whose mother was Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Then Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. So Ruth is mentioned there, one of the few women mentioned in the genealogy that starts the Gospel of Matthew.
They come from the tribe of Judah?
All right?
No, Rahab, she was the one they thought was a prostitute, that they said.
She may or may not have been, but she was the one who had.
Innkeeper or something, you know.
She helped the people get out of town. They sneaked or went out and broke down her window. And then
She was the mother of Boaz, so when he probably wasn't open to somebody from a different culture. But she was the mother of wife,
yeah, and so and I'm not sure how they
his
all.
mother was Rahab.
Yeah. So that might fit in. So the key thing of the book of Ruth is people who aren't from here can be good, and all of us, including David, I'm sure have some kind of non-Jewish blood. All right, so with that book tells us that not all foreign people are bad. They can be as good as us. How about nations we really don't like? It's like Moab's not like an enemy of us. How about we take a look at that with the book of Jonah? All right, so most people, when I say, what's the book of Jonah about? It would be like, suppose you said to me, so it would be like, suppose you said to me, Father, tell me what the Super Bowl was this year. And I would say, okay, the both teams punted, then Los Angeles scored a touchdown, and then Cincinnati got a field goal, so it was 7-3. You would say, well, okay, well, that's the first quarter. Okay, you want to tell us about the second, third, and fourth quarter? Okay. For the people who say that Jonah is about a prophet who didn't want to go somewhere, but God makes him go anywhere, that's the first quarter. As a matter of fact, it's only an introduction. So that's not what the book is about. All right, so just like Jonah, or just like Ruth was, the setting was during the time of the Judges. The setting for the book of Jonah is during the Assyrian Empire. So Remember, Assyria had conquered Israel in 721 BC and controlled them for over a century. And the capital of Assyria was Nineveh. All right, so the story says God asked Jonah to be a prophet. Well, if you're a prophet, who are you going to be a prophet to? Almost all were prophets to Israel, right? If you're going to be good. But God says, no, I want you to set out to the great city of Nineveh and preach there. So what does Jonah do? He goes to Tarshish, and anyway, that's the other direction. He's supposed to go east, and he's going to go west. So he said, I want nothing to do with Nineveh. I want nothing to do with the people of Assyria. All right, and that would be the normal response of a prophet and all like, why would I want to go and talk to people that we don't like? So then they tell us a story of gets on a ship going the other way and there's a storm, so it must be somebody's fault here, whose is it? And we throw him overboard. Anyway, that's not meant to be taken literally, that's part of the story here. That tells us something really, really important. I think one of the words that I gave you the first time was didactic. So Jonah is a didactic book, meaning it's meant to teach us something. And it should be pretty clear what the teaching is by the time we finish it. So the first chapter is the story there about the fish. I don't think it's possible for a fish to be able to spew you out near Nineveh, because Nineveh is not near water. So that's another thing to tell us, okay, there's something more important here than these fish. Yeah. So there's something else we should be paying attention to here. And then the second, what's chapter 2? Psalm of Thanksgiving. Okay, so yes, some guy gets thrown into the water, gets swallowed by a fish. The first thing he's going to do is praise God. Okay, so yeah. So anyway, that's again to tell you, okay, we're not, the important part is coming up. All right, so that's chapter 3 and chapter 4 is where the important part comes from now. So now Jonah is in Nineveh. He didn't want to go there. This story makes no sense if you don't understand what the city of Nineveh is. Right? It's the capital of not only our enemy, but the people that conquered us. So it wouldn't be too much different than today's having somebody from Ukraine being told, I want you to go to Moscow and tell the people there to repent. God wants them to repent, and don't forgive them. The person might, I'm not going there, I'll take on the other direction. I'm not going there.